Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our the Hurricane Hub discussion. Yes, I said the Hurricane Hub because we are changing, I guess, a little bit of a rebranding from the Hurricane Outlook and discussion to the Hurricane Hub. I guess it's just a different way to kind of brand our discussions, just to, I don't know, give it a little bit of a refresh because for the past 2 years we've been doing Hurricane Outlook and discussion, but now I feel like, why not change it a little bit, change things up, spice it up a little bit, I guess, with what's going on. And today, of course, for Monday, June 20th, 2022, took a little bit of a break for the past few days, but now I'm back and starting today, now officially starting today, I promise you, I will be posting every single day up until the end of the hurricane season, so we can get the latest on everything that's going on in the tropics. And of course, that is the case right now. Not too much going on in the Atlantic, but I say but because that could change. Models are hinting at possible development of tropical wave activity that'll come off the coast of Africa and develop somewhere around here, the Western MDR, or in the Caribbean too. Models are hinting that things might be a little bit favorable in the Caribbean, and we might even get multiple signals too that models are hinting at to develop in the MDR and the deep tropics of the Atlantic. We'll go a little bit more into that in just a second, but first of all, Celia in the Pacific, 30 miles per hour and 1,008 millibars. This really has been like some sort of weak storm that's been just meandering off the coast of Central America, and it's gotten, in my opinion at least, it's gotten very close. Multiple times for a long period of time, it's gotten pretty close to degenerating off the coast of Central America because it's kind of gone some time without its convection, and its low level center was exposed entirely. Um, at some points while it was just meandering off the coast of Central America, but it's been getting a little bit better on its satellite presentation, and we'll talk in a little bit about Celia. That models, once it starts going towards the west northwest in a few days, it'll start getting much better organized, and it could be the Eastern Pacific's third hurricane, if you can believe it or not. A lot of us were thinking that this year's East Pacific season would be below normal because of the La Nina. Well, I guess not. Models, and I'll go over that in a little bit, but the National Hurricane Center and models are hinting that we might see Celia become the third hurricane of the Eastern Pacific season in just a little bit. But before that, of course, our brief look at climatology, and that, of course, obviously includes the sea surface temperature map in the Atlantic and the Pacific too, which includes the La Nina and the obvious very warm Atlantic region, very cold subtropics too, much colder than normal relative to the past few years. And my goodness, we'll take a look at this in a little bit up closely. But the Gulf of Mexico flaming hot because we have that huge southeast ridge which is keeping the Gulf Coast very warm. And of course, it's obvious that the shelf waters, including, will warm up a lot, and that's where we have a bunch of these valleys which are well above normal. Boy, if this lasts by the time we get to the peak season and whenever we get a storm out here in the Gulf of Mexico, this is not going to be good at all. The storms in the Gulf of Mexico will have a lot of energy to work with, and it's obvious because we have very warm sea surface temperatures out here, and so we might have to see what takes advantage of it. And of course, the Gulf will always be ready for hurricanes because it's always going to be above normal relative to the rest of the Atlantic Ocean. The Gulf of Mexico does tend to have warm waters a lot more easier because of the loop current. But especially when you see this type of warmth, look at that. We see anomalies along the shelf waters of the Atlantic as much as 2 to 3 degrees Celsius above normal, and that is a lot. That means a lot more energy added to the ocean for storms to take advantage of, and it's a troubling sign for sure. And we'll have to watch how that evolves throughout the season, and if it lasts or even gets even warmer, which I hope it doesn't. But the northwestern Atlantic too, very warm. The MDR, obvious, very warm, and as obvious too, the eastern Pacific is very cold. The negative PDO, which is a very big factor for suppressing activity in the eastern Pacific this year, and of course, allowing for energy to consolidate in the Atlantic, which will obviously allow it to be very active. And then, of course, a moderating and a slowly kind of dying out La Nina, but it's still generally there. We still have a signal for a very warm Pacific, a very cold Pacific, I should say. It's actually been warming in the past few days. Obviously, you can see these warm anomalies starting to pop up along the equatorial Pacific, but it's not going to an El Nino. We're not seeing these becoming rapidly widespread, and in the next few days, we are likely to see the trades begin to pick back up across the equatorial Pacific, and we'll probably see the resuming of strengthening of this La Nina that's out there. But nonetheless, none of this is a worry because, as is obvious by now, the Atlantic is warm, which is a plus, and the Pacific is cold, which is a negative in the Pacific. And in general, this will play in turn to favor rising motion and focused energy in the atmosphere in the Atlantic. So this is not really concerned at all. And another data set. Oh no, I gotta turn this off. That was from June 1st. Just a little bit of a difference that you can see between the two. And this is another data set too. And I wanted to bring this up from time to time, but I forgot to. This is the NOAA NESDIS Reynolds SST weekly sea surface temperature anomaly analysis, and this is valid as of 2 days ago, June 18th, 2022. Also, my mom and my sister's birthday, so that's something to keep in mind. But generally, when you go from data set to data set, it basically shows the same thing over an average of the past few weeks. The MDR has been generally warmer than normal, a nice horseshoe off the coast of Africa. Also very noted here, a little bit less on the map here because this is by singular day, but still you notice a very noticeable horseshoe of warm waters that stretch from the Canaries down into the MDR. And of course the warm Gulf too is also very present, and as you look out towards the Pacific, the anomalies in the Pacific are consistently below normal, and that's also noted here over the past week in the Reynolds anomalies. And basically, it just confirms what we already know. Whether you go from data set to data set, it all shows above normal Atlantic and below normal Pacific, and it definitely shows that the pattern this year is definitely favorable for the Atlantic. But how is it looking right now? I guess not as favorable as we are thinking for what we'll see for later this year, but it's obvious because it's June. We won't see things favorable yet, but you can see a pretty potent tropical wave moving closer towards the Trinidad and Tobago and the Lesser Antilles. And this will probably move into the Caribbean and fizzle out. Of course, things are not that favorable for development, but of course, as I mentioned later, it might be a little more favorable for development in the coming weeks because models are hinting at something coming out. We have a lot of thunderstorm activity, of course, off the coast of Central America between the Yucatan and, of course, the Central American landmass, all associated with this huge Central American gyre, as we like to call it. A lot of cyclonic a lot of cyclonic winds in the lower levels around the Central American area, on both the Caribbean and the Pacific side, and which is why we're seeing a lot of this thunderstorm activity by Central America on the Atlantic Caribbean side. And on the Pacific side, we had Celia, we had Agatha earlier this year, and we had Bloss, which is, by the way, degenerated into a low pressure remnant low today. This is why we had all this activity, and also 93L a few days earlier. It's because it's forming from this Central American gyre, as we like to call it, this gyre of low pressure that's allowing for cyclonic spin in the lower levels, and of course whatever energy we had, which in this case we had a decent amount of energy for the Central American gyre to kind of enhance, and that's why we had all this activity go on. And of course that's why we have Celia, which I'll show you here. Celia still not looking that defined today, but of course we'll look at the National Hurricane Center in a little bit as to it's getting better, and we'll show you what it means to us as that Celia is getting better and more developed. Because what this means is in the future, Celia looks like it could strengthen back into a tropical storm, and even by the time we get to the 4 or 5 day outlook period, the National Hurricane Center has this becoming a hurricane, and it would be the third hurricane of the Eastern Pacific season. Interestingly enough, it would be the third named storm and the third hurricane at the same time. For some reason, a lot of the storms in the Eastern Pacific this year that would become named storms and strengthen into hurricanes. Definitely a very interesting year for sure in the Eastern Pacific, but nonetheless, no major direct impacts to land. Of course, other than rip currents, that would be the usual impact, especially with storms offshore. Rip currents, though, could still take people's lives as they have before. The waves can kind of grab you and pull you into the ocean if you're not careful enough when it comes to swimming along the coast. So, as Celia remains offshore and strengthens likely over the next few days, keep that in mind if you're a surfer along the coast of Mexico. But other than that, zooming in on the Gulf Coast, as we did talk about before, the anomalies are very warm along the Gulf Coast. That translates to the actual sea surface temperature anomalies. And take a look at the shelf waters here, 30 and even 31 degrees Celsius. And is there even a little bit of 32 in there? My goodness, you don't see 32 degrees Celsius all that often at all, even globally. Some areas don't even reach 32 degrees Celsius. Only the warmest and the most rich, deep tropical waters in not even the Atlantic, places like the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, where their tropical waters are deep and rich. That's where you see 32 degrees Celsius. But the good thing is that this is along the shelf water, so in a way it's kind of easier to get these warmer temperatures because you don't have a lot of water to warm to get it very warm. And of course, we've been seeing very persistent warmth across the Gulf Coast, so that explains it. But as I said before, if these anomalies last, this is going to be a real big sign for hurricane season as to what happens. Because if we see a lot of these anomalies last, like 28, 29 degrees Celsius, decently across the whole central and northern Gulf, that's not good. Because especially we've seen these past few years, storms take advantage of the warm waters somehow, especially in late August, where we would randomly see these storms in the Gulf of Mexico come in, and then things are just favorable enough that they're able to take up of all these warm waters that we've been having in the Gulf recently. Of course, also associated with why we've been having a major uptick in rapidly intensifying storms in the Atlantic as a whole in recent years. It's because we've had these storms, especially in the Gulf, where just come in and just take advantage of all the upper ocean heat content that's there. And especially with the year like this, where we have a lot of that, especially with waters along the shelf coast at 30, 31 degrees Celsius, especially only in June. Compare that to the past few years. That's a mixture for trouble, as I like to say. It's certainly something we'll have to see as it evolves, but that's alarming, for especially if it um, pans out later on. We'll have to see, of course, but it'll be something surely very interesting to watch for sure. But now we got to take a look at what the models do show for the Atlantic, because we did talk about that there's activity. And notice on the GFS as we go roughly to the 96-hour time period, watch this wave. I think it's this wave that tries to develop, but you do see here by the time we get to 120 hours out, by the time we get to the next week or so, you notice we start getting a bunch of these robust waves out in the Atlantic, and at least on the GFS vorticity, you can see that one of them tries to consolidate and become something. Of course, it will have to battle these very strong trades that are out, of course, in the Atlantic, which is why this is still a little bit iffy. And then you see another wave behind it too that tries to consolidate. And you know that these are trying to consolidate because take a look at these very high concentrated vorticity values. They're not extremely high, but they're noticeable. And the GFS has is not the most aggressive model with this. If we take a look at a model like the Euro, for instance, you could see that them two also have hints of something trying to consolidate there in the Atlantic. You could also see, especially in the lower levels, more cyclonic activity trying to consolidate and I guess turn in the lower levels, and that's how you know that there's some sort of vigorous tropical wave that tries to develop. And then as you go in towards the Caribbean, you notice that there's a more concentration of strong vorticity, and that it eventually moves on into the Caribbean, and maybe we'll have to watch it there. And by the time we get to the next 10 days, which we shouldn't go past that. Notice that we do have another strong wave that tries to get going. That's also right by the Caribbean too. And we'll take a look at the ensembles here. Notice how there's a low pressure, a very strong wave develops, and there's a lot of model support too, moves into the Caribbean, and then that's when some models start to develop this a little bit more. Some activity off the East Coast too. There's been some talks of a mesoscale type system. We know how those go. They come off the coast and develop, but we have that. And you can generally see how it lines up with the European on the operational. Something that comes in, moves into the Caribbean, tries to develop, gets a little bit stronger as it, and a little more potent as it comes into the Caribbean, and then there's another wave that trails behind it. So generally, what can I say other than an uptick in activity for sure? The MJO, the Kelvin wave, is moving through late June, will help enhance these waves as they come off the coast of Africa, and of course try to spin up. But keep in mind it's still June out there, so don't be surprised if this doesn't develop, because we still have to keep in mind the dry air, the Saharan air, and especially if you go back to here, this map, you can see that there's a lot of low level those low level kind of like ghost clouds, those feathery ghost clouds on the lower levels, very much a representative that there's a lot of mid-level and upper level dry air, of course associated with the Saharan air. We'll have to see how this fares by the time we get to the time where these waves start trying to develop. We'll have to see if that that mid-level dry air still remains, and if this tries to impede these waves, especially with them trying to go into the Caribbean, as we always talk about the Eastern Caribbean being a graveyard, because sometimes waves don't develop that well, especially if storms are not well developed by the time they get to the Caribbean. There's something about the Eastern Caribbean that always tends to have, especially early on, and it only lets up by the time we get to peak. We have very strong, fast trades, and it's not just the Caribbean, it's the deep tropics in general, which is why we don't see a lot of development all the way out in the MDR in June and July, not in normal years. We don't have it. Sometimes in real hyperactive years we have it. There's a reason why it doesn't happen. It's because there's a lot of strong trades, and this will really have to battle that if it wants to get going. But the models do show that this will be an intense wave that tries to come in and develop. So if the models show it, it's a signal to watch, and it's something we'll be definitely keeping an eye on for sure. But really quickly before we close out, just want to show you a little bit of the CPC IRI. We haven't looked at this in a while, but what do they show? And this is generally just regarding ENSO. They generally show what we're already thinking. La Nina being the predominant factor by the time we get to the ASO, August, September, October period, which is the 3-month peak period for the Atlantic. We see that La Nina is the predominant factor that will be occurring in this time period. So that basically means the only thing we'll really be watching for to be the most important is the La Nina during the peak season. And of course we know La Nina does tend to favor hurricane activity the most. And by the time we get a little bit towards the latter end of the year, notice how we see the La Nina kick up once again by the time we get to the September, October, November period, October, November, December, November, December, January. La Nina chances begin to kick up again as this tries to become a third year La Nina, if you could believe it or not. A third year consistent La Nina. Haven't had this in a while, and it'll definitely be something interesting for the season for sure. We have really not seen these 3-year in a row La Nina periods for winter, and they've not occurred often. So if it happens this year, it'll definitely be something interesting, and it'll definitely be something interesting for the Atlantic, especially to watch to see what occurs, and we'll be right here with it to track, of course, with what happens this year. And of course, if you want to be here with us, you will need to subscribe, because how else are you going to get your notifications for the videos to this channel? Obviously, like, subscribe, comment, and share, and send this video to all your friends that live along the coastlines this year, and those that are even just interested in hurricanes. You can tell them to tune into this channel. We'll be talking about the tropics all year, and I'll definitely be here to talk about everything else too besides the tropics, such as winter weather. So if you're interested in that, definitely come in and subscribe, and we'll definitely see how the season pans out from here. Certainly looking like an interesting season ahead, and we'll also be watching that wave, of course, that we're just mentioning, and see whether or not it develops in the MDR, like models are hinting at it too. We'll have to see. But other than that, everyone, thanks for tuning in for today's discussion. Um, have a great day. Stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to all, and we will talk again tomorrow. See ya.